Hey, welcome to the latest episode of The Voices of eCommerce. I'm John Drake, professor of Management Information Systems at East Carolina University. In this podcast, I interview the incredible people behind the scenes of e-commerce, the people that design, build, market, and run various online, mobile, and social initiatives. And now, on with the show. So welcome, everyone. Today we are with Arthur Zay. Did I pronounce your name right?
Sure did.
Zay. All right, cool. So Arthur is, he's worked in a bunch of different tech companies out in California, from Autodesk, Twitter, and CD Networks, among other places. And now he's working at Amazon as a senior technical product manager for Alexa, where he works on the Alexa developer portal. So welcome to the show, Arthur.
Thanks. Good to be here.
All right. When I was doing a little research about you for the show, I discovered that you have kind of an unusual background for an IT professional, in that your undergrad is in mathematics, and then you went and got a law degree. And I guess you could talk about that choice of career, but really what I'm interested in is how has those two different backgrounds helped you in your career?
Yeah, I think math was definitely more applicable, just in that it helped to sharpen a lot of those critical thinking skills that end up being useful in technology. Also, there were plenty of electives that I was able to take as part of that major that were directly relevant. So lots of CS classes and so on, especially because the particular flavor of my math major was math of computation, which is basically math with a computer science twist.
Right.
So that was definitely helpful. I would say that in many respects, it was all very abstract, and a lot of the ways that we were learning about technology and coding was through C++. So not exactly, depending on what area of tech you work in, the exact coding language or style or environment that most people are doing today. But as far as kind of getting a sense for how to think about that kind of thing, that was very helpful. I don't think that law was especially helpful from the perspective of my tech career. I got into law because in undergrad, I got very interested in philosophy, and I thought that law would be a very good application of that interest. Turns out that, let's just call it a mistake of youthful naivete. I got this idea in my head around what the practice of law would be. It was all very romanticized, based on TV and movies and so on. And I went into it. I also suffered a little bit from this idea that I am not a quitter, so I stuck through it. I wouldn't say that it's been completely useless. I think there are some things that I learned from being in law school around how to disagree with people more effectively. But aside from being able to say things like, well, gee, now working as a product manager, I can kind of appreciate the legal implications of various things and coordinate more effectively with our legal folks whenever something like that comes up, and kind of understand the ins and outs of things. I mean, that's all great, but not worth the massive amount of student loan debt that I ended up going into.
Yeah,
so
right.
Would not recommend that path for somebody just because you're interested in tech.
Sure.
But while I was in law school, I was a network administrator for a few years. So it wasn't exactly it's not like here I went to law school and then I pivoted into tech. It's kind of like a thing that's been with me my entire life, just continued on. And I decided, you know what, this is where I want to go. And it was actually during that part-time job that I ended up discovering that the thing that I so enjoyed doing had a name, and it's called product management, and then decided that that is what I was going to do.
So when you say product management, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, that's a good question, because basically every different company has a different definition of that, and different companies are dogmatic, even maybe in different ways about what that means. You'll definitely see some companies that treat product management to be quite a bit more, let's call it businessy, in the sense of being more about business analytics, right? Defining success metrics, defining a go-to-market strategy, working very closely with um, like a go-to-market team on launch partners for a particular product. And so it ends up being very launch oriented. You'll see some product managers who are very much about the UX design of things and spend a lot of time working with designers. And so, for example, you're working on a website or a mobile app, you'll actually maybe be wireframing things and defining like, here's what the workflow looks like, and then working with a full-time designer to flesh that out a little bit. You'll see some product managers like me, I guess, tend to get super into geeky technical details like API design. In that case, it's actually not too different from the UX oriented product managers. It's just that, the user experience that we're designing is for a technical customer.
Right.
But yeah, so it's very different in different places. Amazon typically treats its product managers as, how can I put this? Very much on the defining the what, not the how. So you're defining what is going to be built, not how it is going to be built. And
Okay.
I wouldn't say that distinction is super clear in all cases, but they really like their product managers to be writing what at Amazon is called a PR FAQ, which stands for press release, and then FAQ, the frequently asked questions that we all know about, and that's kind of like the primary document that product managers are responsible for creating to kind of like work backward from a customer. Anyway, hopefully that kind of gives you a flavor for the diversity of different
Yeah.
kinds of product management that I've seen. I could tell you a little bit more about what it's been like at other companies, but
So if I had to differentiate it from a project manager, the project is usually more of a closed in, defined time period or specific job that or work that needs to be done, whereas product manager, it's more ongoing. I mean, I know you mentioned that some product managers uh, do go through the implementation part of that. And I guess that almost takes on a role of a project manager. So would I be right in that
I think
differentiation?
that's partially true, but that might be not the essential difference.
Okay.
So, a project manager or sometimes a program manager, that's usually a quantitative difference, right? Project is usually a little bit narrower in scope or a little bit simpler in terms of complexity, whereas a program manager usually is around a lot of different areas that all need to kind of come together to achieve something. I think the more essential difference is that a product manager actually defines what the product is and is actually involved in at least some high level aspect of the design, determining what we're
Mm.
going to launch. Whereas the project or program manager is more responsible for the coordination of the logistics. So a lot of things around process and
Right.
helping teams collaborate more effectively and so on. But they're not really making any kind of substantive judgment calls around what should be built or even how it should be built, right? They might facilitate engineers being able to coordinate effectively on how something should be built, but they're not really exercising any kind of let's call it design sense. Now, that's just in terms of essences, right? You're going to see a lot of product managers who are heavily involved in coordination of various things, because to launch a product, you've got to be able to do that. You're also going to see a lot of program managers exercising a lot of judgment around both the what and the how, because their positioning between so many teams or working with so many teams oftentimes allows them to see a certain kind of high level that helps them to make recommendations on how to resolve any kind of issues that might not have been foreseen by any of the individual teams on their own. And for that reason, like, you're also going to see companies like Facebook. They have what's called a goodness, I can't remember the exact title or classification, but I think they have a role that they call a program manager, but it's kind of like a product program manager, where their TPM, their technical program manager, is actually closer to what a lot of other companies call product managers,
Got it.
just because they end up exercising, again, a lot of that design sense, a lot of that.
Mhm.
uh,
Gotcha. And so your job at Amazon, again, I mentioned this earlier, but you are work with the Alexa developer portal, right? So is that, you'd say you're the product manager for that portal? Is that correct?
Kind of. The portal actually encompasses a couple of different areas, and I can talk
Okay.
about that briefly.
Sure.
But just by way of a little bit of context, so when I first started at Amazon, it was on what you might call the Alexa Core Services team. It's undergone a lot of different internal names, but for 2 years or so, I was working on a team that was actually delivering internal services that other internal teams were leveraging in order to make the whole Alexa experience work. So we were a little bit more device oriented. So it was more around developers who were creating Alexa devices and being able to integrate against that API platform. Um, we're not really supposed to use the word platform, so actually that's not the right characterization, right? Like it's the set of services and APIs and so on.
Yeah.
And that encompasses both first-party devices and also third-party devices and third-party developers. And so it's very different from skills, right? If you're Uber, Headspace, or whatever, right? They're creating experiences, but we were creating a lot of the internal services that were leveraged more directly by devices and device software. And because of the work that I had been doing there around getting our API framework all straightened out and working well and so on, I actually ended up getting connected with the tech docs team for devices. And so they're the ones who are responsible for documenting all of the different APIs that we have. If you're a third-party developer, here's how you get started with the platform, and here's the description of all the various features and what APIs they depend on and so on. And I ended up switching over to that team in April 2019. And so I've been with them ever since. And we've undergone a few consolidations with some other tech docs team. And so the technical documentation piece is one part of the Alexa developer portal.
Okay.
There are other parts of the portal which include what's called the developer console. There are a few different flavors of that depending on what kind of developer you are. But that's where you actually go in and you manage your particular product, right? So if you're actually developing a device, that's where you go. You register your device. You tell the system about how it works and so on. Same thing, like there's a console for skills if you want to build a new skill, and that actually helps you design a lot of your skills too. So console is another big part of the, broadly speaking, developer portal. And then we have what you might call the marketing site, and that's all of the content that's not directly technical in nature. It's still oriented toward a technical audience, but it's more about helping them to understand at a very high marketing level what Alexa is all about and what kind of different offerings Amazon has that they might be interested in.
Wow.
So I just work on the tech docs part of it.
Yeah.
So the team that I'm on, it's basically, aside from our manager, we've got a whole bunch of tech writers and we've got a content editor. So all of us together end up documenting all of the different APIs and offerings that we have for third-party developers.
Right. And so, so real quick, and for the people who don't know, an API is the application programming interface. So that's when you have a little piece of software, that's the way you can connect to it without, physical connecting. That's the other piece of software can basically talk to one another.
The elevator pitch that I give around that for people who don't know what an API is it's just a set of standards for different systems to talk to each other. Yeah. And a lot of people probably have had the experience just using various apps on their phone where maybe there's something like login with Facebook, right? And so the whole experience of using some other app and you don't want to create a new account, you just click the login with Facebook button, that leverages a set of APIs that Facebook makes available, which then allows whatever app you're using and Facebook to talk to each other in a standardized way. So it's things like that. But for us, it's at least, for example, device APIs. It's telling third-party developers who are creating their own Alexa devices, here's how you have to code your software so that it can talk to the Alexa systems.
Right. Good. That's a great explanation. Thank you. So I poked around on your website and I found a nice quote. I thought, well, this would be a good question for you. But you said the most consistent and frequent trigger of your anger
Yeah.
is bad UX on mobile apps and websites. What is it about that triggers you so much?
I almost don't know where to begin. Actually, I think the catalyst for my putting that down is that I got a lot of sass from my brother about this, telling me that the frustration that I experience when I'm trying to use an app and it's got this really either unintuitive or just really stupid UX where it's just like this obvious thing that they ought to have done differently. I get so angry about that. And he's like, dude, you're being totally uncalibrated about this. Like, why are you getting so upset about this thing? Like it doesn't matter. Like the inconvenience that it causes you is not calibrated to this intensity of anger. Even accepting the fact that in general I have very big emotions about basically all of the things all the time, and reflecting on that, I realized that it's not really about the individual instance of bad UX or the inconvenience that some bad UX has caused me. It's like the principle of the matter. And for me, it kind of reflects this kind of thoughtlessness and carelessness about creating something, about building something. It's this lack of pride in your work. Now, look, that might be a somewhat ungenerous characterization because also working at a tech company, I know oftentimes how much pressure there is just to launch something that like at least kind of works. And so I can't be too condemnatory of anyone in particular, and I don't want to be too presumptuous about what caused any particular instance of bad UX, but I care so passionately about the customer experience, right? The user experience here, that a thing should just work. It should be natural. It should be intuitive. There should not ever need to be an instruction manual on how to use things. Like if something requires an instruction manual, you probably didn't design it well. Now, that's not universally true, but it's a good idea to keep in mind when you're thinking about UX design.
Right. Yeah.
But I wish I could give you a fuller explanation for why I get so agitated, but it is more about the principle of the matter. It's this idea of thoughtlessness, carelessness, lack of pride, lack of any sense of responsibility around doing a good job and like taking ownership over what you're delivering. Like those are the things that I'm having the big feelings about.
Yeah, understandable. And so it sounds like you've taken this passion with you to Amazon. How do you realize that, especially in like technical documentation? I mean, that would seem, I don't know, by very nature, having worked with technical documentation before, most of it is not necessarily easy to work with. So how do you take that passion into your work?
Yeah, so directly, I would say it manifests as wanting to create documentation that makes sense, right? I think, if I'm being characteristically immodest, I'll say I have a pretty good knack for, let's call it, kind of taking on beginner's mind with documentation. So I think I'm pretty good at being able to not assume too much specialized knowledge on the part of my audience. Now, my not explaining what API stood for earlier was maybe not the best example of that. But I kind of guessed that your audience would know what API was. Typically, I don't assume that people know what that is, but in general, with our documentation, right? We don't need to explain every instance of an acronym like API, but we do need to explain various things about, here's what the workflow is like, not suddenly introducing jargon that people don't already understand without maybe linking it to a place that does explain it, et cetera. There are a lot of different manifestations of that in terms of creating documentation that is sensible. For me, the biggest thing is consistency. It's actually really hard, it seems, for when you have lots of different teams building their own APIs and kind of having their own kind of conceptual model of how our API surface works. They don't necessarily have the right sense of like what constitutes an API, how to characterize the different workflows, and so on. So bringing that consistency to how we frame it in our technical documentation is really big for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, maybe somewhat polemically, one of the things that I'm especially passionate about as well is the API design itself. So you could argue that being on the tech docs team, it's not really my job to engage in the API design itself, right? At the point that our team gets involved, you expect the API design to already be done and perhaps even implemented. And that may be true to an extent. I don't think that that's necessarily the most effective operational model. Frankly, I think that because TechDocs is much closer to the front lines with third-party developers, we're very well poised to be able to provide valuable input and feedback to the teams actually designing the APIs, who tend to be a little bit more removed from the developers, perhaps surprisingly, but org structures are what they are. And so I'm very passionate about getting involved in API design. I'm a frequent participant in our API review process, where teams building and designing APIs get feedback from more senior and principal engineers. And so I'm very involved in that, being part of TechDocs and seeing a lot of different APIs across the spectrum. I'm able to give feedback on things like the consistency of the API design itself with other APIs and how to name things well. And, I'm a huge geek about organizing things effectively. So perhaps unsurprisingly, I love figuring out just the right way to model data in JSON. JSON being, what is that called? What does it stand for?
JavaScript object notation.
Oh, good. Oh, my guess was right. It's so funny. Like, I use JSON as an acronym all the time.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, I mean, this is the kind of descriptive notation that's used. I guess pioneered for use with JavaScript, but is now used across many different languages as a standard for modeling data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, there we go. That's you answered that one well. that was good. All right. So, what does your day-to-day work look like? I mean, I know you do a lot of technical documentation. Is that you do the documentation yourself? Is that part of your role, or is that?
Sometimes I usually help out with tech docs in a pinch. It's not part of my primary job description because we have folks whose title is actually technical writer.
Got it.
And they're the ones who are primarily responsible for that. The irony, in a way, is that because I'm so heavily involved in API design and review and have so much context, having worked on some of those internal service teams, I oftentimes know a lot of these APIs like the back of my hand. So it would take me a lot less time to be able to accurately document these APIs than tech writers who might not have been involved. Mm-hmm. So in some cases, I act more as a liaison by helping to provide tech review of technical docs, mm-hmm. and provide some amount of guidance on maybe you ought to structure this way or explain it this way because, this is actually what the conceptual model is across the board, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. But there have definitely been times where I've published whole sets of documentation just because, we were somewhat short-staffed and we needed to get something out the door, and I had the skills and could do it quickly, and so I went and did it. So that's a part of my job for sure. And I'll pick up random odd things. For example, I'm part of our team's on-call rotation. So if somebody's submitted an issue internally to do a quick fix of a typo or something,
okay.
Right?
Yeah, I was going to say, what on-call for technical documentation just seemed odd. I'm surprised by that, but.
Yeah, I mean, it's mostly kind of triaging inbound requests, but if it could also be something super critical, like, oh no, you exposed the name of some internal thing on the accidentally, but so we'll act quickly around things like that. But yeah, this is not on call where we get paged at 3 a.m. This is just on call where, during normal business hours, we have an SLA of some amount of time to answer any kind of inbound requests through any of our various communications channels. But my personal day to day, it's somewhat varied. So one of the things that I'm most focused on recently is actually writing one of these PRFAQ documents that I mentioned earlier, because uh, you can think of tech docs as the product itself, but you can also imagine some more, I don't know what you want to call it, narrower deliverables. So, for example, I don't think this is especially confidential. The one of the things that we'd like to be able to do a little bit better is auto generate some of our API reference documents from specs that the teams that are designing these APIs are onboarding. Mm-hmm. So if they're able to describe their APIs in a highly structured, normalized way, then we can consume that and build some tooling in order to transform that into the HTML assets that are then served up on our developer portal. Right now, technical writers are spending a lot of time on actually looking at internal documentation that these teams are creating and attempting to transform that, wrestling. We use Markdown to actually create our documentation, and then that gets built into the actual HTML assets. Markdown is another kind of, it's a human readable way of formatting content that then can get transformed relatively easily into something like HTML. But that there's a lot of opportunity for error there. It's a lot of wasted effort in terms of just wrangling with formatting. There's a lot of this that really ought to be pretty deterministic, right? The tech writers' distinctive value that they're adding in terms of their expertise is being able to have a good command of the English language and apply that to explaining technical concepts. That's the essence of their value. The essence of their value is not, I know how to format Markdown well, or I'm good at mechanically transforming this internal spec into, something in Markdown that hopefully will follow the pattern of all of the other. Like, it doesn't make any sense to be doing that. So that's something that I'm focusing a lot of my energy right now. We have a lot of different kinds of APIs, and so figuring out what's the fewest number of different generalized specs that we can create, or I should say specs for specs. So right now I'm still in a little bit of research mode as I'm creating this, and so I'm getting more and more familiarized with those parts of our overall API surface that I haven't thus far been especially familiar with. A big part of my job also is just working with teams who have various inbound requests and helping to make sure that those things get routed to the right technical writer. Sometimes it's just fielding questions about, it has more, in fact, to do with my previous role at Amazon. But it's things like, hey, we're building such and such API, and we're curious about your perspective on like how we might do this. Another big part of my day to day is, I think I mentioned already, is some of the API review and API design. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to think. And this is actually a little bit more in the spirit of being a program or project manager, because it's a little bit more around internal tooling and processes. But I'm a huge geek around our Git workflows. So if you're familiar with Git, it's a kind of yeah. So I'm even wearing my GitHub t-shirt today.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
So we don't use GitHub for our own technical documentation on developer.amazon.com, but we do use GitHub for open source things like our various SDKs. Anyway, but Git as a technology is really a revision management mechanism. That's the highest level way of describing it, but it allows lots of different people to collaborate on the same kind of stuff or the same files and the same project, and to be able to merge those things in, resolve any kinds of conflicts around stuff. So it's a revision management kind of tool. And so figuring out how we can have a whole bunch of technical writers working out of the same repository of documents, making sure that they're not trampling over each other's work, making sure that we have a way of making it possible for internal stakeholders to review drafts of content internally before it gets published. So we have all these different kinds of workflows for that. And I was heavily involved and drove the design of those workflows and actually created the internal documentation for our team around that. I'm really big on, if you're familiar with JIRA, it's a type of issue management software. I say issue management, but it's like task and project management and so on. So I designed a lot of the things around our JIRA processes, both in terms of how issues get onto our radar in the first place, with other internal teams being able to file issues with us. And we have this like robust intake process, as we call it. And then also how everybody on our team can use JIRA in a relatively consistent way. So we have good reporting on what we're spending our time on. It's easy to see who's working on what at any given time. We have like a launch calendar that's automatically populated, so internal stakeholders and other teams can see what tech docs are going out soon, etc.
Nice. Yeah. No, am familiar with JIRA. A former student of mine and works at Cisco, and they were using JIRA as their agile project management tool. And he showed us all the ins and outs of how they're using it and how they do their daily scrums based off of their list of, incoming issues, and not issues, but what do they call them? Their user stories. So it's pretty flexible. So yeah, it's a cool little tool. All right. So got a hard question for you. You ready for it now? Trying to think about some time you've had a hard problem on the job, or some sticky situation, and tell us what led up to that situation. What was some of your thought process to get through it, and then what was the outcome?
This feels like an Amazon interview question, right? It's like situation, task, action, and result. I might have actually asked exactly this question in an Amazon interview.
Nice.
So I would say that probably the most challenging areas are interpersonal. I don't know that there's ever been anything that's like, I'm trying to think if there's ever been a particularly difficult technical problem or something to do with the substance of the work. Honestly, most of the difficulty will arise in an interpersonal context. I don't know how much I necessarily want to get into specific scenarios, so I'm not sure if I'm going to give you the exact situations or results or whatever, but I'll at least tell you in broad strokes the kinds of things that might happen.
That works.
One of the challenges that I confront often is that because my title is product manager, people have an idea in their head of what that means, and sometimes they kind of like pigeonhole me into a certain idea of like their idea of what a product manager is supposed to do. And so it's not that anybody's actually ever said this particular thing explicitly, but there are people whose attitudes basically amount to, who is this product manager who thinks he has a right to have an opinion on technical issues? And this attitude is most often manifested by senior principal engineers. Certainly not everyone. Like, there are definitely senior principal engineers whose respect I've definitely earned and who are very keen on soliciting my viewpoint on things because they care more about whether I have the relevant experience and expertise and not what my title is. Something judged by the content of my expertise and not the letters in my title.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, actually, it's funny because I do think in a way that the propensity to misjudge people in that way is very closely related to the kind of erroneous judgment that people make in being racist and other forms of like just discrimination generally. I should say just
So,
qualify kind of discrimination, but that kind of situation comes up, and it's actually very difficult to figure out how to deal with. I don't know that I have a particularly good solution for that, other than in some cases it's worked to work one-on-one with some of these engineers and help them to understand, oh yeah, actually Arthur has an engineering background and has some expertise in this, and it so happens he's a product manager, but whatever. Some people actually do just get very dogmatic about like roles and responsibilities. So regardless of what my experience or expertise is, they care more about like, yeah, but your job is to do X and you just do that.
right.
And that can definitely be frustrating. And oftentimes in those cases, there's no winning. And so you just learn to maybe avoid working with those people if that's possible, or see if you can inject your opinion in a different way. One thing that I found can be useful is, and I don't like having to expend energy on what amounts to what sometimes feels like rhetorical manipulation, but figure out how to transform the opinion that you have into asking a question that can cause the other person to feel like they came up with the idea in the first place, right?
Right.
Sure, it feels good, and people want to be able to take credit for things that they came up with. Believe me, I am one of them, right? Like, I like credit that I have earned, but at the same time, more often I care more about making sure that we're doing the right thing than who came up with it and who got credit for it. So,
Right.
if somebody else's, fragile ego requires that they feel like they came up with a thing, fine, I'm going to come up with some way of seeing if I can help them to feel like they came up with it. So that sometimes means asking certain kinds of questions. Sometimes it's asking a leading question. Another time it might be, this is actually a trick I learned from a parenting class I took this one time, where you actually offer an alternative, where it's like, basically, well, do you think A is a better idea or is B a better idea? Where A and B are maybe both things that even you yourself came up with, and both of which would actually be okay with you as fine solutions. And by presenting the person who's actually entitled to make the decision this alternative, they get to feel like they're exercising some amount of agency or control or ownership over how it goes. And so that tends to help them to feel more comfortable with it, even though maybe you came up with the idea, right?
Yeah, you kind of frame the decision for them, and then let
Right.
them
And then they
make
get to
the
make the
decision.
decision, and they feel good about it. And if that's what you got to do, because some people are sensitive in that way, then,
Hmm.
okay, then that's what you got to do. Anyway, so that's one big class of difficulty. Sometimes, you're just working with people who have abrasive personalities. I
Yeah.
don't have a lot of good answers on this particular score, other than, don't take it personally, right?
Right.
Usually, usually the unpleasantness that another person is manifesting is the result of some other thing that's going on with them,
Yeah.
and it's not about you. And taking it personally is not going to help the situation anyway. I don't know how much I like the word taking it, or the phrase taking it personally. I feel like there's a little bit of imprecision there, and it could mean different things, but hopefully most people know what I mean by that. I think there's a way where you can react to somebody else's instigation of friction. Um, and I just lost your video, and I'm not sure.
I've lost yours too. It must be one of ours.
Womp
Networks
womp.
are not doing so hot right now, but that's all right. I can still hear.
Let's see. Yeah, I have this error message that video is not currently available due to low bandwidth or local computer conditions, such as CPU or RAM use. Are you getting a similar one?
I haven't gotten that message yet, but your video is gone. So let's just keep going. That's fine.
Sure. Okay. So I think somebody else's instigation of friction is easy to respond to in a defensive way. I think really the thing that can help in terms of one's own experience with something that has helped me to react effectively rather than, just reacting uncritically is to recognize that this person is probably doing the best that they can. The best that they can may not be acceptable, it may not be good enough, but they're probably not trying to intentionally make things difficult for you. They're probably not intentionally being abrasive or difficult. It's reflecting something else that's going on with them. And again, you don't have to excuse their behavior, but I think being more understanding of it can help you to not just get emotionally wound up yourself and to then react in a way that ends up encouraging this kind of vicious feedback cycle. And so it really depends on the person and maybe their receptivity to having any kind of conversation about it. But yeah, times when I've landed in that kind of situation, sometimes I've talked to them about it explicitly, sometimes by not reacting in a negative way in response and kind of focusing more on trying to keep the interaction pleasant. Um, so I think the second thing I was saying, sometimes you can actually help to get a relationship back on track, not by necessarily uh, uh, dealing with the situation head on, but instead just trying to create more positive interactions with the person, helping them to kind of subconsciously or implicitly recognize that they can drop whatever armor they had going on that was making that maybe was triggering their being unpleasant with you. And then just kind of getting on better footing by just having more positive interactions with the person. And then in some other more extreme cases, like you go talk to their manager and say, "Hey, look, I'm struggling with so and so. I'm not really sure what's going on. I don't necessarily want to speculate, but the interaction is unpleasant. Here are the results. Like here are the specific behaviors. Like here's what I wish would have happened, and so on. What would you recommend?" And at the end of the day, talking to their manager is a good idea because they can help advise on the most effective way of dealing with someone that presumably they know better than you do. You kind of like figure out the effective. I think that's always. But so these kinds of things, I don't know that they're specific to tech, right?
No.
The challenging scenarios, they're not. They're certainly not specific to Amazon. And yeah, they're not even specific to work. Right?
That's a good point. Yeah.
Which is why, like I mentioned, some of these techniques, I learned from parenting classes of all things, right?
Yeah.
Super applicable to all areas of adult relationships. But honestly, those tend to be the more difficult things that I've wrestled with professionally.
Mm.
I think it's certainly a magnifying effect for me that I'm a little bit of a radical element in that I'm pretty atypical as far as product managers go because I am very technical and really care about the technical details. And, I have skills in lots of diverse areas. And so I'm really happy to jump into any one of them to try to get something done. And that oftentimes challenges people's preconceptions around what they think a product manager should be doing. And sometimes I inadvertently step on people's toes in terms of like doing their job for them. Some people are appreciative of that because like, thanks, you've like taken this work off my hands. And other people feel a little bit defensive about that. And, I understand that. But yeah, so it is the interpersonal dimension of things can sometimes be a little bit more challenging for me. But anyway,
I think we all have that. So,
yeah.
so we're getting close to an hour here. So I got one more question for you. What type of advice would you give somebody who wants to get started in the tech industry, whether it's, as a product manager or even technical writer or whatever? I mean, you have a variety different of experiences from administrator, systems administrator, and you did some development in C++, you said so. But where would you recommend people get started today?
I would definitely advise people to get more experience and more diverse experience. And I mean hands on the job experience. I found that even though it was helpful in various respects, ultimately school was not nearly as useful to me in terms of preparation and kind of really understanding what real working in tech would be.
Mm.
And by the way, like there's no degree that you can get in product management, right? Like there's, it's a subject of a lot of interesting, uh, let's call it internet opinions, around product management as a field, right? You have product managers who've gone to business school, and then you've got product managers who transition from actually being developers, and
Mhm.
everything in between. My recommendation is definitely like go out and get lots of actual experience, get a part-time job doing something in tech, and then kind of jump around and see what kinds of things you find yourself very attracted to. um, it was definitely a value to me wanting to go into product management that I had a lot of experience around a lot of different areas. Um, and that really gave me a really good appreciation for all the things that kind of come together in terms of actually designing and building and launching a product.
Mm.
But yeah, honestly, I don't even know how much I would recommend any particular schooling or coursework specifically, in particular uh, around like formal university programs or anything like that. The most success that I've seen is actually people taking or attending those coding boot camps, and then with almost no expertise before, through this intensive, however many week or month program, suddenly coming out of it being a world class engineer. Like I've seen that
Wow.
on a couple of occasions now. And then people get these fabulous jobs as software engineers, and they're great engineers who know how to think about problems. I mean, it's and if you want to go into software engineering, like that's a really good path, I think.
Okay.
Um, let's see.
It's a good one.
Yeah, like I said, I made a lot of mistakes in my life that I would characterize as youthful naivete,
Mm.
not just law school. So, I'm a big fan of don't armchair philosophize. Don't think that you have this romanticized idea of some field or area or job and that it's going to be true. Like, actually go and try and see.
Mm. Mhm.
So that's
Good one.
that's the
Yeah.
most important piece of advice, I think.
All right. Well, that is all my questions for you, author. It's been a great conversation. I appreciate all your sharing all of your experience, because this is some really cool stuff you're doing there at Amazon. And since I use the Alexa app, hell, I even have a microwave with Alexa on it. So,
Oh, that's neat. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I don't think I've ever used it, but I have it. um, but anyway, appreciate it. And I look forward to hearing from you again.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
Good. Most welcome.
All right. Take care.